miles down the road from Virginia Military Institute, where we were earlier today. We're at Southern Virginia University, and this is just going to be sort of a short stop. This university, the building behind us, was sort of the core building of it, and it was originally built as a hotel during a time of real estate speculation in this area for iron mining. And I guess the iron mining rush was short-lived, and the hotel went out of business, and then later it was acquired and it was turned into a small private college. And that college went on throughout much of the 19th century. Eventually, by the 1990s, like so many small colleges, it ran into financial difficulty. And if you hear behind me, there's a lot of cicada noise going on. So if you're wondering what that sound is, it's the cicadas. And so anyway, they became had financial difficulty. I think they lost their accreditation. And at that time, in sort of the mid to later 1990s, a new board was reconvened, and a large number of members of that board were members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. So, as you know, I've done a lot of field work in the Salt Lake City area and Utah generally in terms of how this fits into the ed tech and the Human Plus agenda and high-level robotics and the Human Genome Project and Pixar. And I was really surprised that essentially this new board, it's not an official affiliate of the church, but it embodies the church's philosophies and principles. And the board, again, is guided by that. And when we pulled up in the driveway today, I would say there's quite a number of Utah license plates here in the Shenandoah, with probably people dropping their kids off to school. This is that time of year. And they're focused really more on reading the classics, classical education, and my understanding from a friend, and I haven't been able to confirm this independently, but that it may be affiliated with a curriculum set up by a person named Reville. It starts with an O, and now his name is escaping me. I don't think it's Oliver Reville, but he started out in Utah, and he was developing a classical sort of homeschool curriculum, and it was centered on Thomas Jefferson. So it was both classics and character education and philosophy and values, which we know are sort of a big deal in the education space these days, but very much around sort of the founding fathers. Like that is the principles, and my understanding is that from this friend that the newly reconvened church under the LDS member board direction sort of embodies that principle. And, it's interesting because one of the professors here, and I couldn't actually find his office, and it said he also lives in Greensboro, so I'm not sure if it's a distance appointment or something that's like a guest professorship, but his Orson Scott Card. And he's an author, he's a well-known science fiction author, and a member of the church, and actually a great-great-grandson, I believe, of Brigham Young. So I've been really interested because a friend who lives in the Salt Lake City area, who is an educator, she's like, Allison, you really need to read Orson Scott Card. I'm telling you, it will fill you in on some things. And so I did, and I started out with Enderverse, and I talked about my main takeaway from that, and I know that became a movie as well, but read the book, because the book's always better. My takeaway from that book was that essentially this premise is that these very intelligent children are taken and trained to be warriors, which in a sense actually is a perfect connection to where we were at the Virginia Military Institute earlier. They were taking really young children to train them up to be warriors of outer space. It was a space fantasy novel. And they were taken from their families, and they were trained up in this new culture, and trained in strategy and technique. And all of the people were taught to sort of love the game that they were in, and to but what they realized as the course of the book went on was that the adults running the game would often arbitrarily change the rules in ways that hurt and undermined children and their psychology and pitted them against one another. And so the adults were not really honest actors in the game. And at the end of this, the main character, Ender, he ends up wanting just desperately to be out of this situation. And he's put in a leadership capacity in a game, really, in a simulation game, to have to decide about dropping a devastating weapon, the Little Doctor, a matter disruptor weapon on a planet of the Buggers, which were their sworn sort of outer space enemies, this hive mind enemy. And he ended up doing it. He ended up dropping this weapon that he really he was vaunted as a hero, because it turns out it wasn't actually a game, it was real life. And this is one of my other takeaways as we look at haptic robotics and wargaming and simulations, is that when we're asking workers, children, people to use these haptic controllers in gamified environments, there's no guarantee we know what's happening on the other end. Like, we don't know what drone that is attached to, or what robot that is attached to, or are we manufacturing something, or are we waging war? And since we're not there, it's at a distance, and this is all military technology and games are being played, that moral in the Enderverse that, oh, guess what? No, it wasn't actually a simulation. This really happened. It was real life. You really just destroyed the entire planet. That was the core. And he was the hero. This is a child hero, because he used his strategy and discipline to defeat their mortal space enemy. But what's interesting is, as the Enderverse series continues, the tide turns, and the culture then realizes that committing what they call genocide against entire planetary culture, civilization, is unethical and wrong. And so Ender goes from being a vaunted hero to a vile, despicable character. And then what proceeds through this is that he essentially becomes entrusted with actually a cocoon of the species that he had killed, that he found through a video game simulation. And he's tasked with traveling the universe to try to find a place to restore what he had taken away. And so that's what the next book series go on. And he becomes what's called the Speaker for the Dead. And in traveling through these interplanetary dimensions, he doesn't really age, or he dodges aging. And so he's really like hundreds or maybe 1,000 years old. But, and people don't know, like, he's in obscurity. And his sister, Valentine, writes as a sort of philosopher, Demosthenes, and these policies about getting along and cultural getting along. And so the Speaker for the Dead is really interesting. Oh, there's a train going through. I'm going to wait for a second. Broadband, the new train lines. Just so you know, right? But trains, communication and connection and resource extraction, that's all really interconnected. But so to me, Enderverse was a good book and interesting, but I wouldn't stop there, because Speaker for the Dead and Xenocide and Children of the Mind actually continue the saga forward into a new space colony. And what's interesting is, so Orson Scott Card, he actually grew up, he was born in Richland, Washington State. And Richland, Washington is essentially the area right next to Hanford Nuclear Station, where they were doing a lot of the plutonium extraction for the Manhattan Project. And his father, I think at the time, was a sign painter. And so he was born there, which is an interesting location to be born, in Richland, Washington. And then his family moves to San Mateo and San Jose. And his father gets an advanced degree, I think maybe even teaches at San Jose State, which is also interesting, because I know the culture there, and that is really central to the whole metaverse saga that we're seeing unfolding. And then his father moved, and he became a professor at Brigham Young. And so Orson Scott Card went to Brigham Young University's lab school for children, and he was a very talented writer, and he was trained in creative writing, which is something today most children don't have. Like, we're not trained, my child, I believe, would be a really wonderful creative writer, but all the Common Core, they were trained to just write 5-paragraph essays. Like, just wrote, like, you're not supposed to be creative. And I remember at open house once, saying, like, this was a sophomore year in high school, like, is there ever going to be a part of, like, the curriculum that involves creative writing? And they're like, well, I think in April we do a poetry month, so maybe then, like, maybe there's a little bit of creative writing in April. So kids aren't trained to be creative writers anymore. And then Card went on to actually become involved in theater production and script writing, and then ultimately made his fame and fortune in writing these science fiction books. There's lots of gnats and bugs. The Enderverse. And so in these latter two books, the Xenocide and more train, Children of the Mind, they're set on a new planet, the next planet they found that has a sentient species. And what's really interesting about this planet is that there's been a virus called the Descolata, and it's killed everything, but there's only one of each kind of creature, like one snake, one kind of tree, one kind of grass, and different species. There's a dyad, so two species, their reproductive cycles are interlinked. So the water snakes can only reproduce in conjunction with the grass that they're with. And these piggies, these like sentient little creatures, can only reproduce with the trees. And what's interesting is that the trees, the tree mothers, their children are born in these tiny trees, like little insects really, and then they go through a metamorphosis and they actually have what's called a third life. And so the males, if you live a virtuous life, what your goal is to be essentially killed and eviscerated, like almost alive, and have all your organs laid over the ground, and from that laying out comes a tree, and then that tree is the third life for the virtuous soul, and then that becomes the father, the reproductive part of this life cycle. And it's quite strange because people don't understand the culture, and they try to kill a human and do the same thing, and it doesn't work because that's not their life. But this civilization then becomes colonized by a Catholic Portuguese village, and then so they study them as anthropologists, the piggies and the tree mothers, and they try to understand, and then they realize there's this deadly virus, and later Ender ends up on this community. And it's interesting that it's Portuguese Catholic, because I've written a lot in some of my blog posts about Brazil and what I think is happening with impact investing, and this is the continuation of the Jesuit mission areas that during, sorry, there's somebody doing edging down there, during the time of that the Jesuits, there were the Portuguese coming and enslaving indigenous people in Brazil, and then the Jesuits were pushing industrial agriculture and manufacturing sort of systems such as they were, and they created missions. And so the choice was sort of, you can stay out and risk being captured and become a slave, or you could become Christianized and come into the missions and then join this essentially a spiritual factory program. And that's what was coming next. And so the Brazilian setting is very interesting because Card did his mission work in Brazil. So he took that knowledge of Brazil and then brought it into the story of the piggies and the planet, and the challenge of the scientists trying to figure out the virus and chasing this quote unquote virus that appears to be sentient and intelligent and encoded through language. That the reproductive cycle of the virus, as they describe it in the book, is about communication through molecular biology, right? And again, we know that Card spent his growing up years in the region of the world where, I don't know exactly the time. This probably was after, because 82 was the Human Genome Project. But there's an intense focus on science, engineering, biotechnology improvement. I mean, this is the site of the Mormon Transhumanist Conference, right? That we get to this next level, and it makes me wonder if it is the third life. But Ender ends up on this planet, and he has a companion in his travels, his interstellar travels for 1,000 years, of something that lives in his earpiece, which is a sentient AI named Jane. And Jane, actually it's fascinating because Jane is his financial advisor, so Ender never needs any money because he's jumping around across centuries, and Jane is like the ultimate algorithmic trader, and so she's like making all kinds of money. So when Ender needs to buy a spaceship to travel to this planet, she totally can just buy the spaceship. And he lives, again, in his consciousness through this earbud. And at one point later, there's an attempt they realize Jane exists. There's this fleet coming to destroy the planet because they haven't followed the rules, and Jane shuts the fleet down, and they realize that something is in what counts as the internet, and they try to turn her off, and ultimately she jumps into the forest, into the wood wide web, into that level of communication. And I feel really strongly that the networked communication systems of the forest and the wood wide web and these ecosystems are really, really central. This third life, this transformation, the attempted scientific domination, and the ethics, right? The ethics of colonizing culture, but also of spirituality and understanding ecological systems and the complexity are all part of what's unfolding. And so I think they're really good books. And so one of the last blog posts I just wrote before coming on this trip had to do with something called phyllotes. You know what? I think I might just walk a bit because this edging machine is really nearby. Would you mind grabbing my bag? So I'm just sorry, I'm gonna step away from the edger. There we go. Timing, right? Life. We're walking. This is the campus. Oh, it's hard to get away from this noise. let's see. Thanks for hanging with me. Let me just see, it kind of reverberates across the concrete. So we pulled up from the parking lot, and I'll show you this in a minute, but there's this whole statue that's called the Armor of God statue, and it has a quote from Ephesians, which is interesting and telling. And if you know me, I feel like my role is to sort of ask for people to be authentic in their faith practices and maybe questioning of institutions generally. So girding yourself for the sacred against all of these things feels pretty important. So, oh look, okay, here's a little fountain. This will be a perfect spot. I'll just stop here. So I wanted to talk about like philotes and interconnections. So I sort of feel like Card's childhood, both in, you have this Richland, Washington, which is Atomic Energy Commission connections, and you've got then you've got San Mateo and Santa Clara and San Jose San Jose State University. There's a lot going on with World Wide Web and other kinds of network systems. And so, in his book, it's this idea of engineered molecular systems and then versus natural molecular, natural communication systems. And so one of his theories that's, again, it's science fiction, it's put in this book, so I'm saying it's just interesting to think about, is this idea of this tiny particle that is like the matter of the universe. And he calls it a philote, 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 I think. And it's for a minor Greek goddess, and she was the goddess of friendship and sex. And then she, like her siblings, I can't remember, there was like nemesis and something else. It was like quarrelsomeness and deceit. And like together, sort of the friendship and sex and the quarrelsome and deceit were the dyads that were the creative force of the universe. Okay, which is interesting to think about, right? Because we're going all the way back to the Greek. And so Card's cosmology, he presents the philotes as these tiny bits of matter that individually have a ray that connect them to planet Earth. And so each little bit is connected, and then they become entangled, like quantum entanglement. And as the entanglements happen, and they become a community, and so they give up their individual tether to the core of the planet, and then they share a common tether. And that relationality of those complex interconnections eventually create patterns like fractals to a point that there is sufficient complexity to have what's called an ayua, which is a soul. And a sentient being is one that has sufficient complexity and the ability to maintain that complexity over time as a soul. And they call that the ayua. And so that as those sentient things, and I'm not even saying it's things that we currently understand as being alive, but in an animist frame, then they have relationships among each other. So those entanglements also co-entangle with other sentient species and create further entanglements. And that is all of these philotic twinings. They call it twinings, which is interesting because I've talked a lot about twinning. But the twinings happen and through these relations, but it is all within the cosmology of the sacred, not the engineered, right? Like, so as we left VMI, the VMI campus, we walked off, and the academic buildings we saw were the engineering buildings and the physics building, and then the library in between. And then there was Lady Virginia and, the chapel. So it was like the righteous war of engineering and physics over nature. And so I think these are all concepts to think about, as we're thinking about molecular design, the engineering side versus the sacred side, the side that's given by God, nature, the creative force of the universe, and then how both the friendship and the quarreling work together, and how challenging that is. And this is what I wrote about in my blog post, where I tried to, about the communication through these stupid digital media things, that I'm doing again. I keep doing it again. I'm trying to figure out how to disentangle. I disentangle from like Twitter and Facebook, and then I re-entangle on YouTube. So there's no perfect solution. I'm not modeling myself as some perfect answer person, but how do we communicate? Like it's not really super functional, these things. And over time we get entangled, we have entanglements, and then sometimes it gets unentangled, and sometimes we don't even know how that happens or to what end. And, maybe we're to the point of thinking like when those things happen, that is the universe, right? There's a passage in time and there's a transition that's happening or what have you. But anyway, this is Southern Virginia University. It has unexpected ties to Utah through this Thomas Jefferson education thing, possibly, and the board, which is members of the church. I'm kind of hoping, actually, when I leave this area and go back through DC, to stop at the Washington Temple, because we made these lovely little dolls, and I think that would be a nice bookend to the time that I had in Salt Lake City, because, again, these are individuals, I would assume, that are members of the temple in the greater Washington area who would have access to sort of high levels of influence. And we have all these timelines, right? We're at the VMI, and we've got sort of the Tudor timeline, and we've got, the Virginia timeline, and the Jamestown timeline, and the Queen Elizabeth I timeline at Shrinemont, and all of this. So anyway, I hope you found this interesting. But look up Card. Like, again, it's science fiction.
The name of the book is Ender's Game.
Ender's Game. The Enderverse is the cosmology. The Enderverse is like the universe that he has created around this figure of Ender. But Ender's Game is the first book, and then I think Speaker for the Dead, Xenocide, and Children of the Mind. And the last two are quite philosophical, and I think a lot of people don't really like them. But especially given his Card's connections in a very distinguished LDS family, I feel like he either directly or indirectly is pulling in information that is relevant to this time. And for me, it is this idea about twining, I think the forests, the natural energetic communication networks, and the ethics, right? Like grappling with the ethics of all the things that we are doing. So I'm gonna actually, I'll walk with us, we'll walk around the front, because I want to show you this statue. It's quite something, especially because as we were at VMI, it was very heraldic, shall we say, lots of flags. And it's interesting from the history standpoint, because we were walking past a group of cadets, I guess the new cadets they call rats, which is, I don't know, that's a little unpleasant. But so we were walking past, and they were carrying the flags, the color guard. And my friend asked, oh, what are those flags that you're carrying? And one of them was the flag of Newmarket, which is a Civil War battle. So it's like the time doesn't stop. My friend Steffers talks about it looping, like the history loops, and then there are embedded artifacts in the looping part. And so I think that the overlap of the story, because Steffers is doing a lot of work, and I've been interested in this too through the ed tech space, around transmedia storytelling across time and space, often in digital media, but I think increasingly in augmented reality, it's going to be embedded in actual artifacts that we're accessing through different tools, these different weird digital tools that are coming. So here, I'm gonna see if I can turn this around. Okay, so here we've got the statue, right? That's something. So this stuff I would assume is new since the creation of the school in the late 90s. And I'm just gonna read this out loud. So again, I'm not proselytizing. I feel like my goal in all of this stuff is to ask people to stand for the sacred, understand that there's something beyond the material realm, and to stand with the creative force and God, however you understand that to be. So I'm just going to read this. So this was dedicated in 2003, and the sculptor of the knight in shining armor, okay, is R. Clay Booth. So put on the whole armor of God, that ye may be able to stand against the wiles of the devil. For we wrestle not against flesh and blood, but against principalities, against powers, against the rulers of darkness of this world, against spiritual wickedness in high places. Wherefore take unto you the whole armor of God, that ye may be able to withstand in the evil day, and having done all, to stand. Stand therefore, having your loins girt about with truth, and having on the breastplate of righteousness, and your feet shod with the preparation of the gospel of peace. And above all, take the shield of faith, wherewith ye shall be able to quench all of the fiery darts of the wicked, and take the helmet of salvation and the sword of the Spirit, which is the word of God, and praying always with your prayer and supplication in the Spirit, and watching thereunto with all perseverance and supplication for all saints. So, again, I guess I'm just going to sort of close with that, but the thing that's going on here, like the weapons that they want us to embrace in this struggle are not going to be the ones that do it. Sorry, they disconnected me. Whatever your faith practice is, again, hold the leaders of your institutions account to life and to God and to the Creator, and to care for your fellow humans and the fellow beings of this planet against this profane campaign of molecular takeover. And yeah, I would say keep the faith. Keep the faith, seek the truth, seek clarity. Try to entangle yourself with good people. Try to understand that we're all human, and part of it is learning. Like, I think, you know, the passage that I read before about the crazy scientist, the X-ray crystallographer trying to like escape the human body. We're here for this for a reason. So, and part of it is being fallible. But the eros is the creative force of the universe to combat the crazy cannon fodder of the VMI, the Stonewall Jackson cannons. It's the love. Like, no one can go up against love. So anyway, thanks for joining in. All right.